Frost had a taste that morning, iron filings and old canvas, clinging to the back of the throat the way fear sometimes does. Staff Sergeant Jack Red Malloy of B Battery, 321st Glider Field Artillery, cupped his hands to his mouth and breathed into his fingers until they hurt, then pried open a green steel can with the point of a bayonet. Fuses rattled like teeth. The 105mm M1 howitzer beside him wore a sugar-white rind. Its breech block, when he thumbed it open, moved with the resentful weight of a barn door. Somewhere past the Bois de Fragotte, a cow bellowed once and the sound flattened against the fog like a fly on glass. The line was so quiet you could hear boots creak and lamp-cord field wire sing in the frost. "Two he left, Sarge," his number 1 gunner said. The man meant 2 full-charge rounds fit for a proper fire mission. The rest of the battery's boxes were oddments, smoke, reduced charges, increments knotted like rosary beads. Malloy ran a glove over the howitzer's trail, feeling grit through canvas wool. Doctrine said a battery could throw 16 to 20 rounds a minute if the mathematics of range, deflection and powder held. The perimeter had been living on single shells and hope. He looked at the sky that had been a ceiling for a week. It pressed down so close that the crown of a man's helmet disappeared into it at 10 paces. In town, under the convent, the school-teacher Marie Lejeune set a kettle to boil with shavings from a chair back. She had learned the smell of iodine so well it haunted her sleep. The cellar hospital's shelves showed their ribs. No plasma, almost no sulphur, bandages cut from bed sheets. When a paratrooper boy tried to hand her his last chocolate D-bar, she tucked it back in his pocket and told him to save it for when he heard good news. "What good news?" he asked without smiling. She didn't answer. She tied another tourniquet, wrote a name on a paper square, and slipped it under the strap of a blood-darkened field jacket. Near division, the story about the surrender demand, nuts, moved through foxholes like a shared cigarette. Some men laughed because it felt like a thing Americans would say even at the gallows. Others took it in with a nod and went back to splicing wire from lamp cords onto reels, working their mittens off every third splice because there are knots only bare fingers can make. A private laid out a field phone on a ration crate and listened to the faint buzzing life of the net. The clearing station had been overrun days earlier before clawing back order. The air had been down. The guns had been stingy. Everything about the siege ran on short rations, powder, plasma, and even words. Hefting around 33 pounds of steel and promise, Malloy would have sworn he could tell which factory had poured it by the burr on the rotating band. That was foolish, of course. Still, the touch told him what mattered. One more blast, one more shock wave, one more ripple in the frozen air to tell a German patrol they'd been seen. He squinted into the fog as a rumour moved along the trench like a mouse. Weather might break by morning. The artillerymen said nothing. They had learned that a man who spends hope too freely ends up paying the bill in a voice that shakes. Time stretched in the way winter frontline hours do, grey minutes that take a day to pass and a second to forget. Malloy counted his increments like pennies. He thought of his mother saving bacon grease, of a switchman's lantern swinging over a Massachusetts rail yard, of the way a garage smelled when the first snow made old oil speak. Across from him, his chief of section took out his pocket notebook and, as if to answer the weight of the silence, wrote the battery's last good ammunition numbers in a square, then boxed the square twice. At 600 it came, not light exactly, but a thinning, a drift in the fog, as if someone had opened a door a crack in a room that had only ever known walls. Men looked up as one does in church when the organ starts. The sound that followed was not German, too steady, too many, too sure of itself. It was a far, layered murmur like a hive heard through plaster, the twin hearts of Pratt and Whitney R1830S working in chorus somewhere above the lid of cloud. Malloy didn't speak. He let the sound travel along his bones and lay spidery hands on the howitzer's breech as if laying hands on a sick child. The wire sang once in the frost, a high, impossible note. In the convent cellar, Marie paused with a bottle lifted against a candle, as if listening could pull the sound closer. The men on the line craned their necks and saw nothing yet. But the air had changed. Everyone could feel it. "Do you hear that?" the gunner asked. Malloy nodded once and smiled without showing teeth. "I hear America," he said, and the fog trembled like gauze. The cargo bay light swung on its wire as if the airplane breathed, a slow pendulum rise and fall over aluminum ribs and khaki web. First, Lieutenant Claire Donovan held a grease pencil in cold fingers and traced the checklist taped to her C-47's yoke. Speed 110, altitude 300 AGL if ceiling allows, drop zone panels white, smoke colour red, door green, bundles away. The crew chief's voice came from the cargo space like a muted hammer. "Are 5 containers secure? Lashings inspected? Safety pins in?" Someone stamped a rubber die into a crate side with the satisfaction of a notary. Ammo, 105 millimeters. The ink looked like good news. They had briefed in a chill Nissen hut the night before. IX Troop Carrier Command, serials stacked like pages, Bastogne the line underlined twice. "If the ceiling comes up," the major had said, tapping a map scarred with grease pencil arrows and little red flags for 20mm and 37mm flak, "you'll have a corridor. If it doesn't, you'll have a story for your grandchildren that begins with the word almost." The Pathfinder lieutenant in the back stood his little Eureka beacon on the table like a lunch pail and explained how a shoebox radio on the snow would sing to their APN2 Rebecca sets, a live blip on a phosphor tube turning a white world into a road. Claire had ferried mail a year ago and flown cows off mud airstrips for a stunt outfit before the war schooled her into checklists and headings. She knew how to fly by feel, but this mission promised instruments and faith. Trust the beacon's heartbeat, honour the scope. She palmed her lucky chocolate bar and slid it into her jacket with a thought of the Bastogne children she had seen in photographs, eyes too old for their faces. The loadmaster, a farmer's son from Iowa who spoke of weather the way priests speak of sin, ran his hands over parachute lanyards that had their own quiet tautness, the assurance that comes from a standard built the same way in the same factories by the same hands thousands upon thousands of times. At engine start, the airplane became what American factories had promised it would be, 2 Pratt & Whitney R-183090Cs turning the cold into purpose, 3 blade props biting an air that had thought itself untouchable for a week. Claire kept a running patter with the crew chief because it kept fear flat. Door static line clear. Clear. Light is green? Negative. Amber. She had flown low-level routes mapped to the foot to avoid those red-flagged flak zones, the sudden murders that waited near bridges and rail spurs, and could feel through the yoke when the airplane sang clean and when it shuddered under anger. Today they would come in low and slow and honest. On the stand, a Rebecca receiver warmed to life, and the tube showed the faintest suggestion of a ghost, an echo that the Pathfinder lieutenant explained would steady into a bright, patient pulse when the beacon was in place. "You won't see the town," he said. "You'll see us." His hands were red from cold, the knuckles cracked in crescents that looked like little smiles, and Claire tried to imagine those same hands pushing a toggle in snow with Germans close enough to hear it click. She had faith in checklists because they were promises made to the future. Do this now, and later you will be alive to do it again. A nation that built millions of parts to the same specification had given her that kind of faith. They droned across grey France, bunched in their serial, the lead ship painting a wake on the air that the others could sit in and trust like ruts through a field. Radio chatter stayed professional and small. The escort flight of P-47 Thunderbolts joined loose and predatory to starboard. Their big radial engines sounded like cousins, and one pilot wagged wings in a gesture that needed no manual. The crew chief opened the side door and the airplane gulped cold. Lanyards snaked to the static line, and the bundles woke with a collective twitching, as if they had heard their names called. The Major had said almost offhand that 241 airplanes would go if the ceiling permitted. Claire had repeated the number in her head like a verse. She knew what 241 looked like on paper. She could not quite see it as a sky, but she wanted to. She ran a mitten over the grease pencil marks on the perspex window where she had scrawled Bastogne and smiled at the childishness of writing the thing you fear into being so you can call it yours. Below them, cloud went from a wall to a curtain to a whisper. The Rebecca tube showed a blip as steady as a heart. "Door," she said. "Green," the chief answered, voice gone gentle. "Bundles," she said. "Away," he answered, and the airplane leapt lighter as if relieved of a lie. Claire pictured what she could not yet see, white fields filling with green and red silk, sled teams arrowing out, medics shouting in a key she remembered from home when a baby cried and the doctor said it would live. She held heading, held speed, and listened for flak. She heard only the round, workman-like thunder of engines doing exactly what they had been built to do. The map on Hauptmann Otto Rehfeldt's folding table was a lesson written by a confident teacher. Arrows showed strides rather than steps, junctions circled as if already held, timings when noon could still command the world. He weighed it down with a wrench because the little stove's heat made the paper want to move. Outside, a Panther's Maybach HL230 coughed to life with a cold lung bark and settled at last into a deep-voiced idle that, even to a man who loved machines, sounded like appetite rather than power. He took out his pencil and wrote the number he trusted more than any order, litres on hand. Orders came down brisk, from corps, from division, from a ghost of the past that believed that will and steel could conquer friction and ice. Take the road net, pin the Americans while others dash for the Meuse. He had good men. He had officers who knew how to turn a compass and read ground. He had tanks that could look a field in the eye and win it. He did not have fuel enough to make a boast truth. Winter had pushed consumption up to absurd figures, 300 litres and more for every 100 kilometres, and he had cavalry wagons ferrying jerry cans because motorised supply had choked to a stop behind wrecks that frozen ditches now held like trophies. He sent reconnaissance to feel for American seams and received back the same story in different voices. The enemy's artillery behaved like a single creature. It could be in many places at once. It knew their roads. There were no crashes of trumpets in the fog, no grand overtures, just the steady, punishing metronome of 105 and 155 and the uncanny knack for finding a stand of trees the instant German infantry sheltered under it. His forward observer described field phones singing across woods as if someone had strung wire through every branch. Rehfeldt believed him. He had served on the steppe, where space punishes the careless. He knew discipline when he felt it bite his knuckles. The Americans had less poetry than his own staff work allowed, and more arithmetic. He walked the line of Panthers before first light. Crews stood close, trading warmth and cigarettes that broke like twigs. One driver had the hood up on a SDKFZ, 251 half-track, and the look of a man trying to convince a carburetor to pray. Rehfeldt told him simply to make it work. The man nodded as if a blessing had been offered. Tanks were gods only until they needed bread. He ran a glove along a glacis plate and picked up a film of frost that glittered under his lamp. 4 vehicles reported under half fuel. 2 were near empty. He told himself there would be Bowsers by 10, that the columns at their back were a river and not a chain of puddles. He raised his field glasses at the perimeter and saw almost nothing but fog that had learned to be a wall. Somewhere beyond it, an American gun crew would be coaxing a breach shut with a palm, as they had 1,000 times. Somewhere a wireman would be biting his teeth together to pull his mitten off and tie a splice with skin that cracked. He respected that kind of work. He knew that his own men were as good as any in the world at the kind of killing the world insisted on now. He also knew that a plan's most dangerous adversary is a ledger. He wrote another number. He did not adjust the arrows on the map. The first noise from the sky came to him as to the Americans it did. A body-felt murmur, engines layered upon engines, too numerous to be a raid, and too patient to be anything but a supply lift. He swallowed the vulgar word that rose in his throat because a captain has to keep the shape of his mouth. Through the glass there were shapes, grey, low, deliberate, and then there were flowers opening above the American lines, green and red in a field that had known only the cruel colours of winter. Parachutes. Refeldt's adjutant, a sober man who had not wasted a single optimistic sentence in months, said, "Herr Hauptmann, they are resupplying the fortress." He gave the only order a soldier can: advance, test, push a flank before it hardens. Panthers crawled forward until roads pinched to ice-slick threads between trees. Infantry moved with the unhappy grace of men who understand that courage burned without petrol makes little heat. The response was instant and mathematical. Fires massed as if one hand had signed for 10 battalions. Bazookas snapped from hedges. A 105 barked in the open and made the air ring like a struck bell. He saw a road junction turn white with splinters and then turn quiet in the obedient way that dead places do. He wrote a word in his little book and shut it quick, as if the page wanted to growl. The word was unhaltbar. He was not a fool. He did not call the enemy amateur or coward. He called them equipped. He thought, with a fairness that duty permits, of factories that could make a ritual of abundance. Later, when the figures were told and retold, he would hear a statistic that seemed like mockery, that the enemy had built more M4 tanks in a year than his nation could field of Panthers in the war, tens of thousands versus thousands, and that on a winter morning 241 aircraft had made a mockery of the circle his corps had drawn around a town. He closed the stove's door against a draught and felt like a man barring a cottage door against a tide. A Pathfinder lieutenant named Keane, nobody remembered his first name afterward, only the way he squared his shoulders before toggling a switch, took a knee in snow that squeaked under weight and set the Eureka on a blanket to keep the cold from stealing its breath. He had a private hold a poncho over him like a priest holds a vestment for a bishop, and in that odd, respectful pocket of shade, he touched the power toggle. A steady tone came alive in his headset, the small, intimate heartbeat of a device that had no fear. He would have smiled if his face could remember the pattern. He raised an Aldis lamp once, shuttered it twice, and listened to the air as if listening could change it. The drop zone lay in a shallow swale, its snow smudged by boots and sleigh runners, its edges marked by panels set in a code that men in the sky would read with the same satisfaction a printer feels when type bites paper. The cigarette on a sergeant's lip burned hot and useless. He let it die because attention is a ration during siege, and he had none to spare. The wire detail had spliced a phone to a little field desk and one handmade switchboard whose wooden front was a piece of a barn door. When the lieutenant said, "Tone is good," the sergeant nodded and said, "Then we have a road." The phrase was wrong and right at once. On the line beyond, Red Malloy kept one eye on the gun and the other, because the other could not look away, on the patch of sky that had learned to lighten. He did not believe in Providence any more than a man believes in being younger than he is, but he believed in radios. Someone near him cracked a red smoke grenade and let it bleed into the wind. The colour looked obscene after a week of grey. Men stepped into the open because there are moments when you decide you want the future to be able to see you. Far out, a P-47 shouldered into view like a brawler ahead of his friends, and then behind it, lower, steady, the first of the transports, the honest shape of a C-47 with a belly full of answers. In Claire's cockpit, the Rebecca tube stopped being a ghost and became purposeful. The blip did not just live, it held still, a lamp on a long road. "Beacon good," the crew chief said, and she wanted to answer in the tone people use when they see a friend waving from a porch after a long absence. She trimmed for 110, felt the airplane lay a palm on the air it liked, and checked altimeter against the wintry bite of the tree line. Flak came up in cotton-black coughs from somewhere reluctant. The escorts widened, hunting for the gunners like dogs pulling scent apart from shadow. The door light shifted. The chief put his hand on the mechanism with a confidence born of repetition that is the truest courage. The first pass felt like stepping through a gauze curtain and realizing there is another room beyond packed with people who have been waiting for you. Bundles pushed themselves into the slipstream as if eager. Silk snapped awake. The airplane lightened with an uplift that slurred into relief, and Claire held her line the way a skater holds a straight path across lake ice when confidence is the only thing keeping the surface from noticing her weight. She could not see the ground receive what she had brought, but she could imagine it with the accuracy that training gives to useful imagination. Green chute crates sledded to guns, red chute boxes carried double quick to the convent, white chute rations stacked like new bricks. Keane toggled his switch again, once, twice, checking. The tone in his headset did not waver. He had memorized he could hold a pen between his teeth to keep it from chattering. He wrote on a scrap the timestamps the way dispatchers write train movements, knowing that someone at division would later draw the arc of a morning on a map with 3 notes and a red pencil. He sent a runner to the edge of the DZ, where a man with a carbine stood with the proprietary look of a farmer watching good weather arrive exactly when the almanac said it would. The runner returned with a thumbs up and a grin so big it looked like an injury. Red saw a sled team appear with the speed of people who have been rehearsing in their heads for days. The first crate to reach his gun was stenciled HE-105mm, its wood dry and splintery. He opened it with a speed that was not haste and handled the shell with the care men reserve for newborns and masterpieces. "Fuse! PD!" he said, and felt the round become a specific promise. Somewhere a medic shouted, and the shout came back changed, not fear, but urgency with a flaw under it. The phone rang at the little field table, and a voice said a grid like a prayer. "Fire mission, battery adjust." Claire felt the ship's tail wag just so as a gust folded off a hedge. She corrected twice, soft. The escort's radio clicked on someone laughing the laugh of a man who has just seen a flak gun go quiet in the decent, clean way. The world narrowed to instruments and craft, then widened at once to the meaning of the craft. She looked once at the chocolate in her pocket and thought, not of her luck, but of a girl in a Belgian cellar asked to hold out her hands. The engines thrummed with the trustworthy thunder of industry, and for a moment she loved every rivet on the airplane, every identical one in every other airplane, the way a soldier loves the men on his right and left. Below, the Eureka's tone went on beating. Above, the sky began to fill. The first silk opened like a small correct miracle, a neat green bloom against the white. Then the air learned the trick and did it again and again until the field looked like a garden that believed in arithmetic. Claire held her course and felt the C-47's weight translate into small boxes of survival falling in the right places. The crew chief counted aloud without meaning to, a litany as old as work. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the ground, the men who had stopped believing in litanies found themselves whispering the numbers as if they'd never said anything else. Flak traced grudging black flowers off the wingtip and broke as a P-47 rolled in to swat at the battery in a hedgerow. The escort's engine note turned purposeful and then happy in the way only aviators can hear. "Door," the chief said again, and "green," the light answered, and away. They made the airplane lighter, the cargo hold transforming from a crowded room into a clean page. Every bundle had the virtue of a plan built far behind the front, colour-coded silk to reduce confusion in adrenalised men, weights set so that momentum would be manageable over rutted snow, canisters sized to a standard lash point so any crew chief on any airfield could rig by memory. It felt to Claire like flying a hymn someone else had written in a better handwriting than hers. Red Malloy ran a sled's rope over his shoulder and tasted cordite already, though he had not fired a round. the first crate's nails came free with a motion no longer controlled by his hands, so much as remembered by them. The fuse went on with a perfect narrow click. The gun, when it spoke with relief. The concussion made the world tidy for a fragment of a second. There is a way a section chief looks when he knows the ammunition point is behind him rather than behind the fog, and Malloy saw that look spread along the line like winter sun hitting a fence. In the convent, Marie opened a red chute box and found the astonishment of glass that had not cracked. Plasma bottles held their colour like fine wine. A medic swore once and made the sign of the cross and then swore again because the first patient's pulse, thready a moment earlier, began to gather itself like someone deciding to sit up. She boiled new bandages, not cut from sheets. She wrote names under the heading 23 Décembre and watched a column she had not seen in days, saved, begin to look like a list rather than a hope. The cellar smelled less like iodine and iron, and for a heartbeat, because someone opened a ration tin next to a stove, a little like chocolate. Repetition became mastery. The transports came in on rails, the beacon made in the air, and dropped to cadence. A second serial followed the first, and then a third. On some runs, men swore they could see faces at open doors, frozen into masks by speed and cold, teeth bared in grimaces that might have been joy. The sky filled with silk to a degree that veterans would later describe with gestures rather than adjectives. Figures differed, tonnage totals depending on who kept the ledger and whether later days were counted, but the picture did not change. In a matter of hours, hundreds of tons of ammunition, plasma, rations and fuel arrived inside a ring of steel the enemy had drawn like a noose. The statistic would sound like boasting if it were not simply what happened. A bazooka team on the Marvey Road used the gift of ammunition to be princely with courage. One private took a shot at 10 yards, far too close to be good form, and the Panther's skirt flashed as if struck with a hammer. The infantry platoon that had taken to counting rounds like coins found itself paying problem after problem with the confidence that there were more coins in the pocket. Field phones sang. Fire direction whispered grid squares in voices that had slept. 10 battalions could be one animal again. Malloy's section shifted trails as smoothly as an arm bending at the elbow, and the second round made a promise to the first. Claire's second pass felt like part of an answer to a question she'd been asking since primary flight. What is an airplane for? Not glamour, not even speed. Connection. She saw a tiny figure wave something over its head, helmet, tin cup, handkerchief, and felt the connection travel up to her through slipstream and wing spar and lift vector. She did not think of the Germans except as a problem already being measured and solved by other Americans in other airplanes with other checklists. She thought of a nation that could make 241 of these ships fly at once and still have more for tomorrow. She thought of the factory floor where her airplane had been riveted and how the rhythm of air hammers had been a promise to a town she had never seen until she saw it from a door at 300 feet. Red swabbed the tube once on the third fire mission just because it felt like respect. He felt the gun's recoil in his boots and steadied his stance in a way his body knew and his mind did not have to approve. He looked back once, through a stand of trees, and saw a parachute hanging like a flag. It was green, and for the first time in his life, the colour meant more than a month on a calendar. It meant the difference between arithmetic that kills you and arithmetic that you can make kill the other fellow's plan. By late afternoon, the light thinned again, a miser's last coins. The cereals peeled off with the tidiness of trained birds. The escort wagged wings in that laconic American way that could carry a paragraph if someone cared to translate it. The Eureka's tone still beat softly in the Pathfinder's headset. He toggled it off and on one last time, the way a man will touch the top of a doorway he loves as he leaves a house. In town, Marie wrote the last name in a column and put her pencil down to stretch her fingers. On the line, Malloy thumbed the breech block open and closed twice for the pleasure of smooth metal. Overhead, the sky, for the first time in a week, felt like a road. Rehfeldt had seen many kinds of weather in war, dust that rose to make a second horizon, rain that turned gullies into graves, snow that hid and revealed like a bad magician. But he had not, until then, considered logistics a kind of weather. It fell. It changed landscapes. It obeyed laws indifferent to courage. He watched through his glasses as parachutes marked with the practical gaiety of red and green landed behind the American line in a quantity that made adjectives childish. He watched men run to them with the particular economy of movement you see when someone is retrieving their own life. He lowered the glasses, because there are moments when an officer owes his eyes mercy. He ordered an attack because the book requires it, and because sometimes audacity surprises arithmetic. Panthers moved until roads became arguments. Infantry shouldered through coppice and the kind of snow that squeaks underfoot like guilt. The first American shell answered as if asked a courteous question, and the next 9 arrived with the kind of discipline Rehfeldt associated with parade grounds. He had heard his men call the enemy's artillery a creature, a thing with a single mind and many limbs, and he had thought it a metaphor until the fire came in pulses that felt like breath. The bazookas were impolite and close. A direct-fire 105 shouted from a farmyard, and the house behind it shrugged off its windows like a man taking off a coat. He sent a runner to pull fuel figures, and the man returned with a page that contained more hope than petrol. A staff captain on the radio spoke of Bowsers stuck behind horse carts and of bridges saved for a different unit's priority. Rehfeldt had no quarrel with the courage of his own. He had a quarrel with numbers. He recalled, unbidden, a magazine article that had said the enemy's Willow Run plant had built bombers by the hour, 1 per 60-odd minutes, as if airplanes could be made like clocks. He did the mental blasphemy that comparisons invite and saw his own fuel column measured against that hourly promise and found himself smaller than arithmetic, once a commander to feel. Reports from the west arrived ragged, spearheads stalling for gasoline, units ordered east, then west, then nowhere, the drive to the Meuse learning that winter eats schedules first. He had believed, as soldiers do because belief is a ration, that weather would keep the sky honest for long enough to run the timetable. The weather had broken in the wrong direction. Now the sky was a factory floor, and every pass by a transport felt like a second hand clicking on a big clock that no longer cared for his map. He told himself that once the afternoon waned, once the transports were home and the dark reasserted itself, the circle would tighten again. He did not quite believe himself. He tried the old comforts, walking the line, laying a glove on steel, speaking a remark so ordinary that men could rest in it. Keep your spacing, watch the flanks, save your grenades. The remarks sounded foolish even as they did their small work. He called for a flak section to move forward and harass the transports. A P-47 found the piece when its crew found a field with a view and made that field briefly important. The escort did not chase glory. It cut hedge and ditch with guns in the honest way of men doing work they have rehearsed until fear cannot find a handhold. Even their dives looked economical. Rehfeldt envied that. He was not blind to the enemy's costs. He saw a parachute caught high in a tree like a trapped flag, a bundle split open by an unkind branch, men carrying boxes under fire and sometimes dropping one because the human body remembers self-preservation even when drilled. But the net balance was so obviously against him that to make a speech about valour felt like being polite at a drowning. Numbers had made a decision, and bravery would now be a footnote no less honourable for being small. The statistic he would repeat later, unwilling because pride resents arithmetic but bound to it by honesty, was not the tonnage or the exact count of airplanes. It was the audacity of a system. A besieged town had been fed, armed and heartened by an air force that treated enemy lines as an administrative inconvenience. The impossible flavour of it, the thing that tasted of mockery and iron, was that the enemy had used hundreds of aircraft for a mission that in his doctrine ought to have consumed a paragraph and a prayer. He thought then of tanks. His army had built perhaps 6,000 Panthers in all their marks. The enemy had built nearly 50,000 Shermans. The comparison was vulgar and therefore clarifying. A single day's American effort to keep one division shooting looked from his ditch like more motion than his nation could afford for a month. Dusk came down like a theatre curtain that had learned to fall slowly. The parachutes dwindled and froze on the fields like stopped clocks. The escorts wagged a last infuriatingly companionable wing and went home without hurry. The artillery stayed, the wire stayed, the men on the perimeter stayed. Rayfelt closed his map and tucked it under his arm like a schoolbook. He would write his report with the candour he owed his regiment and the restraint he owed himself. He would not use the word defeat. He would say timetable, fuel, enemy artillery, weather. He would not say miracle, but alone when the lamp went out and the room became the kind of dark where counting is useful. He would hear engines receding into memory and know that what had rained on Bastogne that day was not weather but decision. Marie learned to listen for the small changes first, the scrape of a real scalpel instead of a sharpened spoon, the way a morphine ampule clicks against glass instead of enamel, the silk whisper of gauze that arrived clean rather than cut from sheets and boiled numb. The red chute boxes had come like promises signed in the air. She cracked straw with mittened fingers and lifted a plasma bottle that had somehow not shattered in a fall a winter morning tried to forbid. A medic, a paratrooper with a barber's steady hands, threaded tubing and said, "Hold tight, madame," as if he were asking her to keep a world still for a minute. The patient's lips, grey a breath ago, found colour with the stubborn slowness of dawn. On the ledger page she had titled 23 December, she added a name under saved and didn't apologise to God for smiling. Red Malloy felt the change in muscle memory. A gun line trained to be stingy became generous because arithmetic had turned. Fuse, PD, he said, and hands moved as if gloves had vanished. Field phones carried voices that had slept for days. The battery could now execute a fire mission in the proper order, observe, adjust, fire for effect, without the shame of stopping the dance halfway. He heard the comfortable liturgy of gunnery snap back into place and let it make him taller. Between missions, he slid a crate lid under his coat to keep wind from carrying heat away because abundance does not excuse carelessness, it requires it. On the transport strip, Claire Donovan eased off her harness and reached for a flyer's thermos with fingers that could not stop shaking. The crew chief grinned in a way that gave permission. "Again?" he said. "Again," she answered, and the word felt like victory, announcing that it had decided to become habit. Maintenance played their quiet symphony around them. Oil checks, magnetos tested, a mechanic's hand laid flat on a cowling the way a farmer touches a good animal. The Rebecca receiver still smelled of warmed bakelight. The tube's ghostly green had imprinted itself on her eyelids, so every blink contained a blip. She tucked the chocolate bar deeper into her pocket and promised herself she would give it to the first child whose eyes didn't look away. In the cellars and convent wards, the ritual of shortage loosened its grip. Plasma meant volume resuscitation instead of prayer alone. Sulphur meant wounds could become futures rather than stories told at wakes. No one said statistics out loud, but they worked on people all the same. A surgeon who had been carving out shrapnel with a pocket knife now tied off bleeders with thread that had not already been used in a dress. The volunteers, mostly women with hands made for gardens and books, found themselves speaking in unit names they had memorized like recipes, 326th Medical, 101st Signal, because it felt respectful to know what you were saving. Out at Marvey, a bazooka team got away with gallantry only because supply had converted gallantry back into a tactic. The loader smacked the tube with his palm to shake out a little icing and barked, "Backblast," like a man who was not too cold to keep rules. 10 yards is for nightmares and legends, but they made it work because the second round was a certainty rather than a prayer. The panther lurched and withdrew, and a corporal laughed once and then coughed hard enough to bring up blood he pretended was a joke. Red's battery walked shells along a hedgerow with that rare accuracy that feels like kindness in a cruel business. The earth jumped in polite pulses and then lay down like a tired animal. To the south, a far engine noise learned to carry weight, not transports now, but ground noise translated by nerves, tracks, double clutching, the bass thrum of something with armour coming nearer. Rumours were a currency in town and had been spent too freely, but this sound was mortgaged to steel. "Fourth armoured," someone said in a tone that did not quite accuse the air of lying. There was still fighting everywhere, a road pinched. Engineers went forward with Bangalore torpedoes and a doctrine that said obstacles were problems with explosive answers. If the corridor opened, when the corridor opened, the arithmetic would stop being daring and start being policy. Through the afternoon, weather tantrumed and settled. The airlift kept returning like a metronome, serials stacked at intervals a conductor could admire. Claire flew a second run, then a third, the white world below styling itself into a map she could read by smell and angle. The woods, the town, the fields now stippled with parachutes that looked like lilies after a flood. P-47S roamed wider, nosing down on road nets and trading fuel for pain in columns that had believed fog would hide them. The difference between a starving town and a stubborn fortress had been measured in hours and engines. Marie's ledger gained another line, then two. She found herself saying small, normal things to patients the way people speak to friends at tables. "How is your hand? Have you eaten? Your sergeant came by," because the extraordinary had finally made space for the ordinary again. She took a child's hand and placed a square of a D-bar in it. It melted slower than hope, but faster than fear. In the far corridor, an American chaplain said grace over coffee, and no one interrupted because even the unbelievers liked to hear gratitude when the words were good. That night, Red looked up at a sky that had gone back to black instead of grey and heard distant guns working to the south in phrases he liked. He took a shell out of a crate, set it down gently, and rested his hand on the stamped letters as if they were a man's shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said to the steel, and believed it would answer. The rumour resolved into physics on the afternoon of the 26th of December, when air learned to carry a different kind of thunder. The men on the south side of town heard it first, as a tremor through their boots, the way a bridge warns you about a train before the rails begin to sing. Then came the notes anyone who had stood on a motor pool line could pick in 3 beats. Continental engines under armour, the clank of track shoes picking up frozen mud and tossing it, the short, coaxing barks of drivers who trusted their transmissions as priests trust sacraments. 4th Armoured Division had crossed someone's last neat pencil line and was pushing a corridor up from Assenois. Red crouched to light a cigarette from the muzzle brake because matches hated him that day and Flame loved steel. He heard a tank commander's voice carry through trees, that confident bray born half from training and half from engines that make a man louder than his doubts. When the first Sherman nosed into view, snow packed under its fenders like icing on a factory cake, men waved with the embarrassed enthusiasm of survivors meeting rescuers in public. The Sherman's commander, goggles up on his helmet, tossed down 2 gifts from a world that remembered itself. Gasoline for a generator and peaches for the ward. "Compliments of CCA," he said, grinning in the way an American does when introducing his fist to a problem he has finally been allowed to punch. Engineers had been up all morning doing what engineers do when doctrine meets ice, probing culverts with bayonets, slotting Bangalore torpedoes under wire like long explosive knitting needles, tucking satchel charges into places where the Earth's stubbornness had convinced lesser men to turn. Every detonation sounded like a textbook deciding to become a story. A platoon fought through the last belt of hedges by the old farm, and a corporal in the lead squad shouted, "Follow me!" with an accent that did not belong to any particular state because it belonged to all of them. The corridor did not so much open as insist. It felt like a zipper learning it could still close even after snow had seized the teeth. Claire, on her third run in as many days, saw the tanks only as suggestions where woods thinned and white fields showed their seams, but the radio net carried the change. Controllers spoke in a tone that had traded anxiety for administration. Corridor status green, evac priority red, fuel convoys inbound by dusk. She glanced at the crew chief, and the grin they shared had in it the very specific pleasure of knowing that a door, once forced, would not easily be shut again. She had started to think of the Rebecca blip on her tube as a heartbeat. Now she imagined the whole map pulsing, the DZ, the road to the south, the route of the convoys like arteries finally unclogged. Rehfeldt's men felt it too, in the way resistance changes texture when it stops being brittle and becomes elastic. He pushed a company forward to test this rumour of armour and found numbers answering him that no captain could shame away. Wire spoke in miles. Field telephones sang as if they had been strung through every tree. Guns that yesterday had been husbanded now spent themselves like men tipping too much on a check because they know the waiter. He tried to imagine a counter-thrust that would cut the artery before it learned to harden. He wrote a request for fuel that showed neither panic nor hope and sent it with a runner who looked like a letter a man hates to write. The junction itself looked small up close, as most places that fight about maps do. A hedgerow curved like a stubborn thought, a frozen ditch pretended to be a wall. The first Sherman into the town limits took a round that rang it like a bell, but could not find the soft parts. Red's gun line stood too with the solemnity reserved for parades and funerals. A fire mission walked out to the south, and the raffish voice of a tank company commander took over the net with that easy shamelessness armour units have when they're busy being the reason infantry can stand in the open. Assenoir secure, link up imminent, he said, and the word imminent felt like a more honest way to say miracle. On the convent steps, Marie shaded her eyes with a hand gone red from work and watched a column of brown uniforms and white scarves appear at the far end of a street that had been haunted by rumour for a week. The tank commander popped his hatch and raised a mitten as if greeting a neighbour. Someone laughed and then sobbed into the same scarf, not because all danger had gone, but because the future had arrived with its engine idling. The peaches went to a boy whose face had looked like a question mark for days. He ate slowly, reverently, as if there were a catechism for sweetness. Doctrine did its quiet business in back rooms. Quartermasters, those unsung trustees of America's pledge, set about converting corridor into routine. Fuel points were established on the lee side of ruined walls. A traffic control team turned chaos into right-of-way with gestures and whistles. Medical evacuation routes were drawn on maps with pencils that did not shake. The first ground convoy rolled in tight and clean, headlights hooded, drivers awake with that special fatigue that only victory allows, because until the outcome is decided, the body pretends it is not tired. Night reclaimed detail without reclaiming momentum. The corridor held like a new bridge under its first parade. Claire taxied past a row of dark airplanes and patted her ship as though thanking a horse. Red leaned his helmet against the trail of the gun and let his eyes shut for 14 minutes with the instant sleep of a man who will gladly wake to work. Rehfeldt closed his notebook over a page that had learned new nouns, armour, corridor, relief, and kept his face trained to blank because officers owe men that small mercy. Marie tucked blankets a little tighter because heat was finally something you could share rather than steal. In the dark south, engines did what factories had promised. They kept a road open. When the corridor became an address instead of a rumour, the American system showed its favourite trick, turning an exception into a habit. By morning of the 27th, the sky over Bastogne looked like a freight schedule come to life. Transports in serial, escorts hunting the margins, fighter bombers out along the road net tipping over on columns that had depended on fog the way a lost child depends on a story. The difference between starving and supplied had been measured in a few hours of engines, but the difference between surviving and advancing would be measured in something more profound, the reflex of a nation to make more, send more, risk more. Red Malloy saw it in the piles of spent brass rising like neat golden anthills behind the gun. A battery that had been counting shells like misers now counted fire missions like a shop counts sales before Christmas. The field phone's voice no longer had the rasp of men bargaining with fate. It had the confidence of an organisation that trusted its own pipelines. He shifted trails, laid the bubble level, and felt in the soles of his boots the clean return of recoil, predictable, technical, deadly in its regularity. Fire for effect, the chief of section called, and the words carried a warmth they had not had a week earlier. Claire rode a pattern that had learned its own muscles. Maintenance turned airplanes around with the choreography of a factory. Pilots moved from checklist to climb with the contentment of craftsmen finally provided enough raw material to execute. She looked down at a road west of town where a column had stalled at the worst possible place, a cold S-turn between black pines and a frozen ditch, and watched a pair of P-47s go to work with 8.50s each, their runs methodical, textbook strafing the way manuals describe it for men who will later pretend they were learning from experience alone. Smoke rose with the particular indolence of oil. Ray Felt's staff began writing "no fuel" more often than "enemy pressure" in their situation reports. A regimental commander west of him reported that a spearhead had reached a village with nothing left in the tanks to do more than idle. Horses, frost-fragile and honest, died in harness because the road would not move for them. He watched a panther be abandoned with the ritual embarrassment of men leaving a friend who cannot walk. The machine looked insulted even without a face. In his notebook, he drew a line and labelled it "timetable", then crossed it the way a clerk cancels a bill. There were statistics a man could make from the ground that sounded like myths until you saw their faces. The one Ray Felt hated most because it was both vulgar and perfect was the comparison between what his nation could build and what the enemy treated as routine. In the time it took a German factory to nurse a handful of Panthers onto rails, American assembly lines had turned out M4 Shermans by the thousands. By war's close, the number would near 49,000, a figure that offends aesthetics while pleasing the battlefield. The rifle in an American private's hands was one of roughly 5.4 million M1 Garands, a citizen's weapon built in citizens' quantity. The impossible taste of it, what would make veterans shake their heads years later with a grin that could not decide if it was pride or disbelief, was how those numbers arrived as weather rather than proclamation. On paper, sorties began to look like rainfall totals in a wet month. Controllers logged lifts and strikes with a boredom that hid awe. The 9th Troop carrier crews took to telling newcomers with a gambler's casualness that Bastogne is on the schedule, the way mill workers talk about shifts. That was the point. Abundance becomes a weapon when it bores the user and terrifies the enemy. A system built to produce refrigerators and cars had turned around and mass-produced lifelines, and in doing so had deprived the German offensive of its most faithful ally, time the enemy can spend while your side waits. Marie measured the same phenomenon in spoons and minutes. She did not need the word logistics to know that she could now hang a new bottle without whispering an apology to the air. A boy in the cellar, quiet for days with that too still quiet that belongs to the very sick and the very old, asked for a story, and then fell asleep before the middle because sleep had become something tired people could have, rather than something wounded people fled. She wrote in her ledger without counting the pencil stubs left in the drawer. Saved took an honest lead. Along the perimeter, doctrine matured like bread. Forward observers learned which hedgerows held Germans now that the fog no longer lied. Fire direction crews shaved seconds off their math, not because they were faster, but because they were rested. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion found angles of fire they had wanted 3 days earlier and now owned. Radios worked, telephones worked, wire teams drove new nails into old trees and smiled at the sound the line made when pulled tight. The system had become itself again. Rehfeldt stood by the road and watched a column of carts make a stunted pilgrimage, breath fogging in a rhythm that had changed from fighting to leaving. He did not despise the men, he despised arithmetic. If a single American factory like Willow Run could once claim a heavy bomber an hour on the line, a statistic so rude it makes polite nations blush, what chance had his map, tidy and correct, against a sky that could export decision by the ton? He put his glove on a panther's glacis, then took it away because cold owns everything it touches in that country. He looked east and did not pretend to his own notebook that tomorrow would be better by will alone. When the siege loosened its teeth enough for clerks to breathe, the army did what armies do when permitted the decency of a table and calm air. It counted. A sergeant with an adding machine mind squared his notebook against a crate and drew his columns with a ruler that had been a yardstick in a schoolhouse. On the left he wrote KIA, WIA, MIA. On the right he wrote shells fired, sorties flown, bundles recovered. In the middle he wrote, for the comfort of symmetry, the dates that would become a window in history, 19th December to 6th January. The numbers settled with the authority of things that would be argued about only at the margins. The 101st Butcher's Bill for that bitter span read 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, 516 missing, a cost paid by paratroopers who had expected to be hunters and found themselves hunted until the air decided to favour justice again. The shell column took longer because artillerymen are notorious for telling the truth about their own, and the clerk wanted to be sure. A detail from each battalion sent up their expenditures with the same solemnity with which a church counts offerings after a hard winter. The totals did not scare him, they didn't comfort him either. They felt like a tide mark after a flood. On another page the airlift ledger took shape. C-47s, 241. Began a line with a flourish because someone enjoyed writing a number that looked like a banner. Tonnage varied depending on which day a man wanted to claim for glory. 144 tons in a span of hours on the 23rd was a figure some swore to and others shaded. But the argument resembled one about whether a hero cleared a wall in one leap or two. The fact remained. Ammunition, plasma, rations and gasoline had fallen inside a circle designed to capture them, and that circle had failed at the simple job it promised. The staff officer who checked the sums could not help adding a margin note. Gave the division new life. Claire found herself summoned to a supply hut where someone wanted to reconcile manifests with lives saved and shells fired. She signed beside serial numbers and felt for once that paperwork honoured reality rather than chased it. The crew chief leaned his elbow on a crate and told a young lieutenant that release speed was 110 miles per hour and that if you did your job you wouldn't have to tell anyone what it felt like because they would be alive to tell you. The lieutenant wrote 110 as if it were a prayer and walked away stiff with the joy of having something important to remember. Red visited the ammo point to marvel like a boy at a repository of things he loved. Stacks of crates showed their stencils like soldiers showing their ranks. High, smoke, fuses PD, fuses VT rumoured for other fronts, but not here, not yet. He ran a hand over a box just to pick up the dust, to say with his palm that he knew how many hands it had passed through. The man who milled the wood, the woman who tied the lanyard on the parachute, the clerk who wrote the number that, if wrong, would still be forgiven because the rest of the system was so forgiving in its size. He thought not of victory, but of labour, of how many unforgiven hours in 1,000 towns it took to bring a single round to his breech. Marie, asked to send up her figures, set the ledger on a crate, licked the stub of her pencil, and wrote what mattered. She did not have the heart to count the dead that morning. She wrote instead the new practice: plasma bottles received, morphine ampules accounted for, bandages cut from sheets to be replaced now by bandages cut by factories whose lines ran day and night. Her French curled into the paper like smoke from a stove. She thought of students and numbers, and found with shy astonishment that counting could be kindness when applied to mercy instead of sorrow. Rehfeldt filed a report that had the virtues of clarity and the pain of honesty. He wrote that the enemy's artillery had demonstrated excellent communications, that the defensive perimeter had shown elasticity consistent with training and morale, that his own units had been delayed by traffic congestion and fuel shortage. He did not write envy. He did not write that he had watched a sky administer logistics as casually as rain. He wrote timetable disruption and chose the passive voice because defeat insists on grammar. He scratched out a phrase that had to do with courage because he doubted the staff above him would want to read that the enemy had more of it than they had been taught to allow. The ledger grew heavier with meaning as it grew more precise. Men would later quarrel in bars about whether it had been 241 transports or a handful more, whether 144 tons had fallen in just over 4 hours, or whether subsequent lifts should be counted in the same breath. Those were arguments men could afford to have because the larger fact had crushed doubt under its heel. Air and industry had collaborated to turn a siege into an appointment. At the bottom of the page, the clerk wrote, "Not because anyone would ever read it, but because truth wants a witness. We are alive because America is larger than a map." In the silence of early evening, the sergeant closed his notebook and set it on the crate as if he were putting a hand on a sleeping child's back. Outside, guns sounded farther away than yesterday. A transport, high and unhurried, droned toward somewhere else needful. The ledger waited, ready to accept tomorrow as calmly as it had recorded today. The lessons did not announce themselves with trumpets, they accreted the way frost takes a window, a quiet, total claim. In a barn-turned briefing room, an artillery S3 held up a map freckled with grease pencil notes and lengths of wire coiled like tame snakes at his feet. "Centralize fire direction," he said to men who already knew. "Decentralize observation." It sounded like a paradox until he traced lines from forward observers to battalion fire direction centres, then to group, then to division, a web a spider would have envied. "One brain, many eyes," he added, tapping a fingernail on a symbol for a 105mm battery. The winter had turned procedure into liturgy. Bastogne made it doctrine. Pathfinders came through the doorway carrying their eurekas like reliquaries, scuffed cases that had called down a sky. Keane, who would continue to refuse his first name as if privacy were a rank, set his beacon on a crate and opened the lid to show a heart too small for the life it had sustained. He explained to a crowded room how panel codes along a snowy field speak to men in cockpits, the way a family's porch light speaks to a traveller, how smoke colours mean this and that, how the Rebecca's phosphor tube turns doubt into geometry. He said, "Line of sight," and then knelt to make a sketch in dust that turned radio frequency into a hill you could climb with your eyes. Claire came in at the back, still smelling of oil and de-icer, and listened with the satisfaction of a practitioner whose craft had made it into scripture. Troop carrier standard operating procedures shifted by lines and commas, short field techniques bundled into training syllabi, low-altitude drops written with the authority of men who had done the thing and returned to argue about how to do it better. She watched a lieutenant scribble, "Release at 110 miles per hour and 300 to 500 AGL in a notebook with the reverence of a postulant. She wanted to tell him that reverence was right, and also that he would learn the feel in his hands, the way a piano student learns the weight of a scale. On the perimeter, Red and his battery practiced shoot and shift as a habit rather than an emergency. Limbers came up quicker. Wire teams carried spare splices in mittened mouths so they could tie with numb fingers. The guns moved between positions before counter-battery could memorize them. A clerk from division artillery came down to watch and returned with a phrase that would appear in a field manual in peacetime prose: "Mobility as survivability." The doctrine had existed on paper. Bastogne had put the punctuation in. When asked later why their artillery seemed to be everywhere at once, a gunner would shrug and say, "Phones," as if the technology had been obvious all along. Rayfeldt's report moved up the chain with its clean, painful adjectives: elastic defence, massed fire, excellent communications, and landed on desks where men underlined the phrases that fit their prejudices and ignored those that did not. But in quiet offices where soldiers think about tomorrow, the German sentences were read with respect, bordering on envy. "We failed to synchronize," one line admitted, a word that sounds like music until you notice that it makes time into a weapon. Bastogne had shown synchronization at its most American, the marriage of factory standard and field initiative, a nation agreeing to a tempo and keeping it. Marie saw doctrine in smaller ways that never make manuals. A medic taught volunteers to stage litters so that the most urgent cases never had to wait for hands. A quartermaster sergeant showed townspeople how to stack rations so the cold did not eat them before a hungry man could, a geometry of pallets and tarps that looked like housekeeping and was, in truth, siegecraft. A chaplain organised a watch at the convent stove, 3 logs on, 2 off, a rhythm that respected scarcity even as relief made it less fatal. In their habits, mercy became as repeatable as violence. There were arguments, the honest kind that build better futures. Pilots debated altitudes as if they were theologians. Gunners argued fuses the way chefs argue salt. Someone proposed a night drop next time and was shouted down not because it could not be done, but because winter had taught the difference between boldness and vanity. In the end, the paper changed. Manuals received new paragraphs whose ancestors had been written in a dozen American tongues and translated by practice into a single sentence. Get it done, then write down how. If anyone wanted the moral in a line, they could recite at banquets, it was not nuts, though that would last because gallows humour travels well. It was something colder, prouder, that a free nation had learned to build systems which let brave men be effective rather than merely brave. The doctrine wasn't a trick, it was a confession that individuals matter and so do checklists, that a sermon can sit comfortably beside a schedule, that love of craft is a patriotic act when the craft is feeding a fortress from the air in winter. The war had asked America what it believed about itself. Bastogne gave one answer in the practiced voice of a technician explaining his tools. At dusk, Keane closed the Eureka's lid and clicked the latch with the finality of a prayer's amen. Red coiled a line and felt the warm coil against his wrist like a living thing. Claire walked out into air so sharp it rang and looked up at a sky that had learned her name. Somewhere to the east, Rehfeldt dipped his pen and began again, because doctrine is what remains after you have told the truth about a fight and still have the courage to plan for the next one. The town slept the way men sleep after a reprieve, hard, shallow, ready to wake with grace. Red found his 14 minutes with his helmet against the trail and woke with mud frozen to his cheek in the shape of a state he could almost name. He stood, stretched the back that had carried the corridor one ration at a time, and laid his hand on a 105mm round as if finishing a handshake begun in the sky. The shell's stenciled letters looked like neat American grammar, HE-M1. He thought of the unseen people, the woman at a press in Springfield stamping gas checks, the man in a rail yard throwing a switch so a train would run on time, the clerk whose careful pencil had miscounted once and still been forgiven because a nation whose scale forgives error is dangerous to fight. Claire taxied slow past a line of aircraft with cowls open like peeled fruit and felt a love that pilots pretend not to feel. She had flown a machine that was honest about its limits and arrogant about its purpose, and for a day, and then another, purpose had been enough. She looked at her grease pencil scrawl, Bastogne, still ghosting the perspex, and thought about erasing it, then decided to let it fade with weather and time, because that seemed more like truth. She had in her pocket a chocolate bar that now weighed like a medal. She would find a child before wheels up and repair in an ounce of sweetness, a fraction of a week's worth of bitterness. Rehfeldt folded the map that had once promised him noon and handed it to a staff officer who would not know what it had cost to carry dignity through a day like the 23rd. He wrote the last line of his report with a care that made the pen scratch louder than the stove, said the words timetable and fuel and enemy air with the exactness his profession demanded, and left out miracle because he had decided that miracles are only logistics seen from the wrong side. In a pocket notebook he kept for himself, he added a private sentence no one would read. They could afford to be wasteful in ways that made my thrift a sin. It was as close to bitterness as he would permit. Marie walked the convent's corridor with the slow efficiency of someone who has already cried and now prefers inventory. Sleeves rolled, hands raw, she checked bandage stacks that did not go down as fast as they had, peered into the stove where fire behaved, straightened a blanket and paused at the bed of a boy who would live. She placed the chocolate Claire handed her into a small hand and watched a face forget war for a second. Later she would add that moment to her ledger as if sweetness were a supply, and perhaps it was. The arithmetic that had kept a town alive rose now to the level of parable. A winter morning had taught that 241 aircraft could turn encirclement into logistics, and that a handful of portable beacons and a discipline of checklists could make a road in the air as reliable as a railroad. America had proven something indecently persuasive to a century raised on myth, that a system built in freedom, factories that produced not because fear forced them, but because consent empowered them, could outproduce, out-coordinate, and outlast a system built on commands. If a single American plant had once rolled a bomber off its line approximately every hour, what poem could a general write that would keep such arithmetic from entering a battlefield and having its say? Red's battery stood down to a rhythm rather than a surrender. Clean tubes, stacked crates, notes made. He spoke softly to his men the way sergeants do when they have bought breathing room and intend to spend it on maintenance and decency. He told a private to sleep before he ate, and the private obeyed gratefully, proof that rank, when married to care, is a kindness. The field phone rang with a request so mundane it felt like a benediction. "Can we borrow a coil of wire?" He said yes, and copied a grid into his notebook with a pencil that did not snap. Claire lifted with the grace of habit and turned toward a sky that had become an American road. She levelled at altitude and thought about the distance between a woman at a bench, riveting panels in a plant, and a soldier in a foxhole handling a shell. That distance had been made small by agreement, to sign, to stamp, to schedule, to show up. She pressed 2 fingers to the Rebecca panel, and not caring whether this counted as superstition, whispered thank you to an instrument that had allowed courage to be precise. Rehfeldt looked once more over his shoulder at the town he had not taken, and decided he would not hate it. He would, if the fates were kind enough to permit him a later life, tell his son that he had seen a factory defeat an army, and that it had been done without insult to the men who fought on the losing side. He would speak the name Bastogne with a soldier's even mouth. Marie closed her ledger and set it beside the stove where heat could dry a corner that had drunk a tear. She stepped into cold that had not learned to be less cruel and opened her hand to catch a flake. It melted the way fear does when given enough warmth and time. Somewhere behind her, an American gun spoke once more, not in panic but in punctuation, and the town answered with silence that meant safety. When the sky finally opened, America kept its promise. That promise would travel, across rivers and borders, across years, to other battles and other winters. It would teach that abundance, organized and offered by a free people, is a weapon tyrants cannot learn to use. It would make a generation of veterans shake their heads, smile and say, with the laconic pride of men who know the weight of metal and the price of blood, we built the road and then we drove it to victory.